The district attorney had spent 18 months building a case that couldn't lose. Then Stephanie St. Clair's lawyer stood up with 14 pages, and the entire courtroom went silent. The courtroom on Center Street filled slowly that Tuesday morning, the way flood water rises, quiet at first, then all at once. By 9:15, every bench in the gallery was taken. Reporters from the Amsterdam News, the Daily News, the Herald Tribune. Police officers who'd worked the Harlem Vice detail. Men in press suits who didn't introduce themselves but watched everything. Women from the tenements who'd taken the train down just to see her walk in. The air smelled like old wood and cigarette smoke that had soaked into the walls over decades. High windows let in gray February light that made everyone look tired. The bailiff stood near the judge's bench, hands clasped, face blank. He'd seen 100 cases like this. Or so he thought. At 9:20, the side door opened. Stephanie St. Clair's lawyer walked in first. His name was James Frazier, and he wasn't the kind of lawyer who performed. No silk pocket square. No gold watch chain. Just a dark suit that fit well and a leather briefcase that looked like it had been carried through a lot of courtrooms. He was a man who understood that power didn't need to announce itself. He moved to the defense table without looking at the DA's side. Set the briefcase down. Opened it. Pulled out a single folder, thin, maybe 14 pages inside, and placed it squarely in front of the chair where his client would sit. Then he stood there, waiting. The district attorney sat across the aisle with 2 assistants flanking him. His name was Martin Holbrook, and he'd spent the last 18 months building this case the way a mason lays brick, one piece at a time, mortared tight, no cracks. He had testimony. He had ledgers. He had raids that pulled runners off the street with pockets full of policy slips. He had everything. He glanced at the folder on Frazier's table. 14 pages. He didn't think much of it. At 9:28, the rear doors opened again. Stephanie St. Clair walked in and the room changed. She didn't stride. She didn't hesitate. She simply walked, the way someone walks into their own home. She wore a tailored navy dress, no jewelry except small pearl earrings, and a hat with a short veil that didn't hide her face, just framed it. Her gloves were buttoned at the wrist. Her shoes made no sound on the marble floor. Every head in the gallery turned. She didn't look at them. She walked to the defense table and Frazier pulled out her chair. She sat, folded her hands in her lap. Her posture was perfect, not stiff, not defiant, just still. The kind of stillness that made people wonder if she was bored or just completely unafraid. The bailiff called the room to order. All rise. Everyone stood. Judge Harold Whitmore entered from his chambers, a man in his 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and a reputation for impatience. He sat. The room sat. The trial was about to begin and everyone knew what the DA had. 18 months. A mountain of evidence. Witnesses who'd been rehearsed. A case that couldn't lose. Holbrook stood to deliver his opening statement. But before he could speak, Frazier stood first. Your Honor, he said quietly, before the prosecution begins, the defense would like to submit evidence for the court's immediate review. Holbrook frowned. Your Honor, this is highly irregular. I'm aware of procedure, Mr. Holbrook, the judge said, looking at Frazier. What kind of evidence? Frazier picked up the folder. 14 pages, Your Honor. Documents obtained through legal discovery. They pertain directly to the integrity of the charges and the conduct of the investigation. The judge gestured. Approach. Frazier walked forward. Holbrook followed, his jaw tight. The 2 assistants stayed seated, glancing at each other. At the bench, Frazier opened the folder and handed the pages to the judge. Whitmore began reading. His expression didn't change at first, just the usual skeptical squint of a man reading legal text. Then his eyes stopped moving. He flipped to the second page. Then the third. Holbrook leaned over, trying to see. The judge didn't let him. He kept reading. 4 pages. 5, 6. In the gallery, no one coughed. No one shifted. The reporters leaned forward, pens ready, not knowing what they were waiting for but sensing it anyway. Stephanie St. Clair sat perfectly still, her hands still folded, her face calm. She already knew what those 14 pages said. Before that courtroom. Before those 14 pages. Before the DA ever thought her name was worth writing down, Stephanie St. Clair had built something most people didn't understand until it was too late to take from her. She came to Harlem in 1912 from Martinique, a woman with an education, fluent in French and English, and no patience for being small. The city didn't make room for people like her. So she made room herself. By 1923 she ran the numbers. Not all of them. Not violently. But in 12 blocks between 7th Avenue and Lenox, from 130th to 142nd Street, if you wanted to play the policy game, you played through her or someone who answered to her. She didn't hire enforcers who broke fingers. She hired bankers who could count. She didn't pay off cops to look away, she paid them to leave her people alone, and when they didn't, she remembered. The game itself was simple. You picked 3 numbers. A runner took your slip and your dime, your quarter, your dollar. If your number hit, you won. Most days you lost. But the dream was cheap, and in Harlem in the 20s, dreams were the only currency that lasted. Stephanie St. Clair didn't invent the game. She just ran it better than anyone else. Her runners didn't skim. If they did, they were gone, not hurt, just gone, and no one else would hire them after. Her bankers paid out on time. If you hit for $50 on a Friday, you had $50 by Saturday morning. No excuses. No short counts. In a world where most people got cheated daily, that kind of reliability was worth more than muscle. She kept an apartment on 140th Street. Modest on the outside, but inside it was a place where decisions got made. A sitting room with good furniture, lace curtains, a radio that played only when she wanted it to. A desk where she kept her own books, written in a shorthand only she understood. A phone that rang at specific hours, and when it did, people on the other end spoke carefully. She didn't go to clubs unless she owned a piece of them. She didn't drink in public. She didn't gamble. People saw her in the street sometimes, dressed well, walking with purpose, never in a hurry but never slow. She acknowledged people with a nod. Not warm. Not cold. Just seen. The neighborhood knew who she was. The hustlers knew not to run their games in her blocks. The rent collectors knew that if they leaned too hard on a woman whose husband played her number faithfully, someone would have a word with their supervisor. The beat cops knew that if they wanted their envelope, they didn't shake down her runners. Those runners were off limits, and the envelope came whether they liked it or not. She didn't rule through fear. She ruled through predictability. And in Harlem, where everything else could collapse overnight, jobs, leases, safety, predictability was power. Her reputation wasn't built on violence, though she wasn't afraid of it. There was a story people told, maybe true, maybe not, but it circulated the way legends do. A man came up from Brooklyn in 1925 trying to move in on her territory. Sent word through a runner that he was taking over 3 blocks, and if she had a problem with it, she could come talk to him herself. She did. Walked into the back room of a speakeasy on 135th where he was holding court with 5 men around him. She didn't bring anyone. She walked in, stood in front of his table and said, "You're leaving tonight or you're staying forever. Choose now." He laughed. His men didn't. 3 days later he was gone. No one saw him leave. No one reported anything. But his men were back in Brooklyn by the weekend and no one tried that again. That was the thing about Stephanie St. Clair. She didn't need to prove herself twice. By 1930, her operation brought in thousands a week. Not millions, she wasn't Dutch Schultz or Lucky Luciano. But she had enough. Enough to live well. Enough to employ 50 people who needed work. Enough to slip money to families when rent came due and the numbers didn't hit. Enough that when she walked into a room, people stood up. She never carried a gun. She didn't need to. What she carried was a network. Runners who'd been with her for years. Bankers who knew that loyalty paid better than betrayal. Shopkeepers who saw everything. Building supers who heard everything. Women who cleaned offices downtown and read memos left on desks. Men who drove cabs and knew which cops were on the take and which ones weren't. A web so quiet that even people inside it didn't know how wide it stretched. When the white mob started pushing into Harlem in the early 30s, they thought she'd fold. A woman running numbers? In their world, that was temporary. Something to be taken. They miscalculated. Because Stephanie St. Clair had spent a decade earning something the mobs could never buy, respect that wasn't based on fear. The community didn't protect her because they were afraid of her. They protected her because she'd protected them. Because she played fair. Because when the police raided a building and arrested her runners, she paid for the lawyers. Because when a banker got sick, she made sure his family ate. The mobs could take territory with guns. But they couldn't take loyalty. And when the DA finally decided to build a case against her, he didn't understand that either. He saw a numbers racket. He saw illegal gambling. He saw a woman who'd gotten too big, too bold, too visible. He saw someone he could break with paperwork and testimony and the weight of the law. He didn't see the 14-year foundation underneath her. He didn't see the people who would risk their jobs to slip her a memo. He didn't see the loyalty that doesn't show up in affidavits. He saw what he wanted to see. A criminal. A target. A conviction that would make headlines. Stephanie St. Clair sat in that courtroom because the DA thought he had her cornered. But she'd been cornered before. And she always walked out. Martin Holbrook didn't decide to go after Stephanie St. Clair overnight. It wasn't personal at first. It was political. By 1933 the city was drowning. The Depression had gutted neighborhoods, left families starving, turned proud men into beggars on street corners. And while the banks collapsed and factories closed, the numbers racket kept running. Money kept changing hands. Poor people kept losing dimes they didn't have, chasing dreams they'd never catch. The reformers wanted blood. The mayor's office wanted headlines. And Holbrook, ambitious and sharp, wanted a case big enough to build a career on. He'd been an assistant district attorney for 6 years, prosecuting bootleggers and small-time con men, grinding through cases that ended in plea deals and probation. He was good at his job, meticulous, relentless, the kind of lawyer who read every document twice and never missed a filing deadline. But good wasn't enough anymore. He needed a win that mattered. A conviction that would put his name in the papers and his face in the conversation when the next DA retired. Stephanie St. Clair was perfect. A woman. A numbers queen. A Harlem figure who'd operated openly for over a decade while the city pretended not to see. Arresting her wouldn't just be justice, it would be a statement. A message that the law applied uptown the same as it did downtown. At least that's what he told himself. He started in the summer of 1932. Quietly at first. Pulled old arrest records for known policy runners. Cross-referenced names with address registries. Built a list of people who worked for her, people who played through her, people who knew how her operation moved. He had 2 assistants working full-time, plus a half-dozen police detectives assigned to what they called the Harlem Vice Detail. The first raids were clumsy. They hit a barbershop on 138th Street where a runner supposedly took slips. Tore the place apart. Found nothing. The runner had been tipped off an hour before they arrived. The owner, an older man who'd run that shop for 20 years, stood there stone-faced while they appended chairs and dumped out drawers. When they left empty-handed, he didn't say a word. Just swept up and opened for business the next morning. Holbrook tried again. A newsstand on Lenox. A shoeshine corner on 7th. A basement social club that doubled as a gambling spot on weekends. Every time the same thing. They'd show up with warrants, badges, threats of obstruction charges. And every time there was nothing there. Slips gone. Money moved. Runners vanished. It should have told him something. It didn't. Instead he got meaner. He started pulling in people on loitering charges, holding them overnight, pressuring them to talk. A kid who ran slips for pocket change, 17 years old, scared, no record. They held him for 2 days, told him his mother would lose her apartment, told him he'd do time in a cell upstate if he didn't cooperate. He cried. He stayed quiet. They let him go and he never ran numbers again. But he didn't talk. A woman who worked as a banker, handling payouts 3 times a week. They picked her up outside her building, cuffed her in front of her neighbors, walked her to a squad car while people watched. Held her for 6 hours. Told her they had witnesses who'd testify against her, told her she'd lose her kids if she didn't give them names, dates, locations. She looked them in the eye and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." They charged her anyway. Conspiracy to operate an illegal lottery. She went to trial 4 months later. The jury took 20 minutes to acquit her. Holbrook wasn't even surprised. The witnesses he thought he had recanted. The ledgers he thought were hers turned out to belong to someone else. The case dissolved like sugar in rain. But he kept going. Because by then it wasn't just about Stephanie St. Clair. It was about proving he could win. About proving that Harlem wasn't untouchable. About proving that a woman who'd built an empire on the backs of poor people couldn't just walk free while the city starved. He got smarter. Stopped raiding street corners. Started following the money. Tracked bank deposits. Subpoenaed Western Union records. Pulled tax filings. Built a paper trail that showed income without a clear source. Showed properties purchased under her name. Showed cash moving through accounts that had no legitimate business attached. It was solid. Clean. The kind of case that didn't rely on street witnesses who'd flip or runners who'd disappear. It was financial. Federal even. The kind of prosecution that couldn't be charmed or intimidated away. By the spring of 1934, he had 18 months of work compiled into 3 bankers' boxes. Testimony from IRS agents. Documents from city clerks. A timeline that showed profit, expansion, operation. He had her. Or so he thought. He filed charges in May. Conspiracy to operate an illegal gambling enterprise. Income tax evasion. Racketeering. The newspapers loved it. Harlem numbers queen indicted, ran across the front page of the Daily News. The Amsterdam News covered it too, more carefully, but the story was the same. Stephanie St. Clair was finally going to answer for what she'd done. Holbrook felt it. The momentum. The inevitability. He didn't know that 14 pages were already being prepared. He didn't know that every raid he'd ordered, every warrant he'd signed, every arrest he'd made had been watched. He didn't know that the same system he thought he controlled had been taking notes. And he wouldn't know until he stood at that bench and watched the judge's face change while reading something Holbrook himself had never seen. The morning the trial began, the newspapers made sure everyone knew. Numbers racket queen faces justice, New York Herald Tribune. Harlem's policy empress in court today, Daily News. St. Clair trial opens, De promises mountain of evidence, New York Times. The headlines weren't neutral. They were hungry. The kind of language that assumed guilt before the gavel ever dropped. They called her a queen, an empress, a racketeer, words designed to make her sound untouchable, dangerous, someone who'd gotten away with too much for too long. The photographs ran alongside the text. Stephanie St. Clair walking up the courthouse steps. Her face composed. Her dress tailored. No fear in her eyes. The captions made it sound like arrogance. Like she thought she was above the law. But anyone who looked closely would have seen something else. Calm. Not the calm of someone who didn't care. The calm of someone who'd already done the math and knew how the numbers would fall. By the time the trial started, the gallery was standing room only. Reporters sat shoulder to shoulder in the front rows, notebooks open, pencils ready. Behind them, police officers in uniform, some who'd worked the Harlem detail, some who just wanted to see her brought down. Behind them, the public. Working people who'd taken the morning off. Women in church hats. Men in pressed shirts. A few faces from Harlem, quiet and watchful, sitting near the back. The bailiff called the court to order. Judge Whitmore entered and sat. The room settled into that tense, anticipatory silence that comes before something important. The kind of silence where everyone's breathing but no one's moving. Holbrook stood. He looked exactly like what he was. A man who'd prepared for this moment for a year and a half. His suit was pressed sharp. His notes were organized in a leather portfolio. His two assistants sat behind him with their own files, ready to hand him whatever he needed. He'd rehearsed this opening statement a dozen times. He knew every word. He stepped forward, hands clasped behind his back, and addressed the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, over the next several days, the people will present to you a case built not on speculation, not on rumors but on facts. Documented facts. Financial records. Witness testimony. Evidence that will show beyond any reasonable doubt that the defendant, Stephanie St. Clair, has operated an illegal gambling enterprise in the heart of this city for more than a decade. His voice was steady, confident. The kind of tone that made people believe him before he even made his argument. You will hear from police officers who have conducted raids on her operations. You will see ledgers seized from her properties, documenting thousands of dollars in illegal transactions. You will hear from individuals who worked for her, who collected money on her behalf, who paid out winnings to gamblers across Harlem. He paused, turning slightly to glance at Stephanie St. Clair. She didn't look back. You will see tax records, or rather, the absence of tax records, for income that clearly existed. Properties purchased. Bank accounts opened. A lifestyle sustained by money that was never reported, never declared, never accounted for under the law. The jury was locked in. 12 men and women, mostly white, a few black faces among them, all sitting perfectly still, absorbing every word. The defendant may appear respectable. She may dress well. She may carry herself with dignity. But respectability does not exempt anyone from the law. This is not a case about Harlem. This is not a case about race or neighborhood or who deserves what. This is a case about crime. Organized crime. A woman who built wealth by exploiting the poorest members of this city, people who could not afford to lose a dime, let alone the dollars they handed over day after day, chasing a dream she knew they'd never catch. His voice rose just slightly, enough to give weight without sounding theatrical. The law is clear. Gambling is illegal. Operating a gambling enterprise is illegal. Profiting from that enterprise without paying taxes is illegal. And for 18 months, the people have gathered the evidence to prove that Stephanie St. Clair did all three. You let that settle. When this trial concludes, you will have no choice but to find her guilty. Because the evidence will leave no other option. He returned to his seat. The courtroom stayed quiet for a moment, the weight of his words still hanging in the air. A few reporters scribbled notes. One of Holbrook's assistants whispered something to him, and he nodded, satisfied. Judge Whitmore looked toward the defense table. Does the defense wish to make an opening statement? James Frazier stood. He didn't walk to the center of the room. He stayed at his table, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, the other holding nothing. No notes. No performance. Your Honor, members of the jury, he said quietly, the defense will present evidence when the time is appropriate. For now we ask only that you listen carefully. Not just to what is said but to what is not said. Not just to what is shown but to what is missing. He paused. The prosecution has promised you a mountain of evidence. We do not dispute that they have gathered documents. We do not dispute that they have spoken to witnesses. But gathering evidence and proving guilt are not the same thing. His tone was calm, almost conversational, as if he were explaining something simple to someone he respected. Mississippi St. Clair has lived in this city for over 20 years. She has run a business. She has employed people. She has contributed to her community. Whether you agree with the nature of that business is not the question before you today. The question is whether the prosecution can prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that she has violated the law in the manner they claim. He let his gaze move across the jury, not lingering, just acknowledging them. We believe they cannot. And when the time comes we will show you why. He sat down. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fiery. But it left a crack in the certainty Holbrook had tried to build. Judge Whitmore checked his notes, then looked up. The prosecution may call its first witness. Holbrook stood again, glancing at his assistant, who handed him a file. Your Honor, the people call Detective William Brennan of the New York Police Department. A uniformed officer walked to the stand, was sworn in, and sat down. He was in his 40s, thick-shouldered, the kind of cop who'd worked Harlem long enough to know every corner. He sat with his hands folded, looking straight ahead. Holbrook approached. Detective Brennan, can you describe your involvement in the investigation of Stephanie St. Clair's gambling operation? Yes, sir. I was part of the vice detail assigned to Harlem. Over the course of 16 months, we conducted multiple raids on locations believed to be involved in illegal policy operations connected to the defendant. And what did you find during those raids? We found betting slips. Ledgers documenting payouts and collections. We arrested several individuals operating as runners and bankers for the operation. And did those individuals identify the defendant as the person they worked for? Brennan hesitated. Just for a second. Some did, yes. Holbrook didn't press the pause. He moved on, asking about dates, locations, amounts. Building his case brick by brick. The jury listened. The reporters wrote. The clock on the wall ticked forward. Stephanie St. Clair sat perfectly still, her hands folded in her lap, her face unreadable. She'd heard worse. And she knew what was coming. The trial ran for 3 days before Frazier stood up with the folder. 3 days of Holbrook's witnesses. Police detectives describing raids. An IRS agent explaining unreported income. A former runner, young, nervous, clearly coached, who testified that he'd taken slips to a building on 140th Street where Stephanie St. Clair kept an office. He didn't look at her when he spoke. He kept his eyes on Holbrook, answering questions in a voice so quiet the judge had to ask him twice to speak up. On cross-examination, Frazier asked him one question. Did Mississippi St. Clair ever personally hand you money or instruct you to collect bets? The runner hesitated. No, sir. Not directly. Not directly, Frazier repeated. Meaning never. I was told she ran it. By whom? The runner didn't answer. Frazier sat down. The prosecution introduced documents. Bank statements showing deposits. Property deeds. A lease agreement for a storefront on Lenox Avenue. All clean on the surface. All circumstantial underneath. Holbrook was good. He built his case the way a tailor makes a suit, one stitch at a time, trying to make it fit perfectly. But there were gaps. No direct testimony that Stephanie St. Clair had ever taken a bet herself. No evidence that she personally handled cash. No witnesses who could say they saw her running the operation with their own eyes. Just people who worked in her buildings. People who said they'd heard she was in charge. People who believed it because everyone believed it. By the afternoon of the third day, Holbrook was wrapping up. He called his final witness, a police captain named Eugene Dorsey, a man with 20 years on the force and a reputation for cleaning up vice in Lower Manhattan. He testified about the structure of policy operations, how they worked, how money flowed from street runners up to bankers and then to the top. He explained that someone like Stephanie St. Clair didn't need to touch the cash herself to be in control. That insulation was part of the design. It was smart testimony. It filled the gaps without needing proof. When Holbrook finished, he looked satisfied. The jury looked convinced. The reporters were already writing their evening editions in their heads. Judge Whitmore glanced at the clock. "Does the defense wish to cross-examine?" Frazier stood. "No, Your Honor." A murmur ran through the gallery. No cross? No pushback? It felt like surrender. Holbrook sat down, hiding a smile. The judge looked at Frazier. "Does the defense intend to call witnesses?" "Yes, Your Honor. But first, the defense would like to submit evidence for the court's immediate review. Evidence that directly pertains to the integrity of this prosecution and the conduct of the investigation that brought us here." Holbrook's smile faded. He stood quickly. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. Discovery was completed months ago. If the defense had exculpatory evidence, it should have been disclosed." "It was obtained through legal discovery, Your Honor," Frazier said calmly. "And it pertains to matters the prosecution itself introduced. We are not ambushing anyone. We are simply presenting facts that the jury has a right to see." Judge Whitmore frowned. He didn't like surprises. But he was a careful judge, not a careless one. "What kind of evidence are we talking about, Mr. Frazier?" Frazier picked up the folder from his table. 14 pages, Your Honor. Financial records, correspondence, and internal memoranda obtained through subpoena. They concern payments made by members of the New York Police Department to individuals connected to illegal gambling operations, including operations that the prosecution has attributed to my client. The courtroom went silent. Not the quiet of anticipation. The quiet of shock. Holbrook's face went pale. "Your Honor, I object. This is a transparent attempt to deflect." "You'll have your chance to respond, Mr. Holbrook," the judge said sharply. "Approach." Frazier walked forward. Holbrook followed, his jaw tight, his hands clenched. The two assistants stayed seated, but one of them was flipping frantically through files, looking for something they'd missed. At the bench, Frazier opened the folder and handed the pages to Judge Whitmore. The first page was a bank record. A deposit slip from a Harlem savings bank, dated 18 months earlier. The account holder's name was blacked out, but the memo line was still visible. "Protection, 135th Street. The judge's eyes narrowed. He turned to the second page. A handwritten ledger entry, photocopied from an original. Names down the left side. Amounts down the right. Badge numbers next to 3 of the names. The third page was a memo typed on NYPD letterhead. Internal correspondence between a precinct captain and a deputy inspector. Subject line, Discretionary Enforcement, Policy Operations, Harlem District. The memo was short, professional, bureaucratic in tone. But the substance was damning. It outlined a system. Certain operations were to be monitored but not disrupted, in exchange for cooperative agreements with precinct leadership. It didn't use the word bribe. It didn't need to. Judge Whitmore read silently. His face didn't change, but his hand gripped the edge of the bench a little tighter. Holbrook leaned over, trying to see. "Your Honor, I have no knowledge of." "You'll get your turn, Mr. Holbrook." The judge kept reading. Page 4 was another bank record. A check made out to a police officer named Brennan. The same Brennan who testified 2 days ago about raiding Stephanie St. Clair's operations. The check was for $300. The memo line read, "Consultation fee." It was dated 3 weeks before the trial began. Page 5 was a photograph. Grainy, taken at night, but clear enough. 2 men standing outside a building on 142nd Street. One in a police uniform. The other in a suit. Between them, an envelope changing hands. The photograph was dated. Time-stamped. Notarized by a private investigator whose name was listed at the bottom. Judge Whitmore set the page down and looked at Frazier. "Where did you get this?" "Through legal subpoena, Your Honor." The bank records were obtained from 3 Harlem banks under court order. The internal memo was provided by a source within the police department who feared retaliation if their identity were revealed. The photograph was taken by a licensed private investigator hired by the defense. Holbrook's voice was rising now. "Your Honor, this is a smear campaign. The defense is trying to distract from the fact that their client ran an illegal." "Mr. Holbrook." The judge's voice was cold. "Did you know about any of this?" "No, Your Honor." Did anyone in your office know?" Holbrook hesitated. "Just for a second. But it was enough. I would need to review." "That's not an answer." The judge flipped to the next page. Another ledger. This one showing payments from a Harlem gambling operation to police officers across 3 precincts. The amounts were listed by month. January through December, 1933. Totals at the bottom. One of the names on the list was Captain Eugene Dorsey. The same captain who just testified about how policy operations were structured and how Stephanie St. Clair must have been running hers. Judge Whitmore closed the folder. He looked at Holbrook, then at Fraser, then out at the courtroom where every reporter was leaning forward, straining to hear, to see, to understand what had just happened. The judge's voice was quiet. Dangerous. Mr. Holbrook, did your office investigate the financial relationships between the officers involved in this case and the gambling operations they were tasked with shutting down? Holbrook opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. Your Honor, we relied on the integrity of the officers assigned to. That's not what I asked. Silence. Holbrook had no answer. The judge turned to Fraser. You have more pages? 8 more, Your Honor. All similar in nature. Bank records. Correspondence. Testimony from witnesses who were threatened or coerced into implicating my client. One affidavit from a police officer who states, under oath, that he was instructed to target Mississippi St. Clair specifically because she refused to pay protection money to precinct leadership. The courtroom erupted. Not loudly. But the murmur was immediate. Reporters whispering to each other. Police officers in the gallery shifting in their seats. Someone in the back stood up and walked out. Judge Whitmore slammed his gavel once. Order. The room went quiet again. He looked at Holbrook. I'm calling a recess. You have 1 hour to review this material and prepare a response. We reconvene at 3 o'clock. He stood. Everyone stood. He left the bench. Holbrook stood frozen for a moment, staring at the folder in the judge's hands. Then he turned and walked back to his table, his assistants flanking him, their faces pale. Stephanie St. Clair sat exactly as she had for 3 days. Hands folded. Face calm. Unmoved. Fraser returned to his seat and said nothing. He didn't need to. The 14 pages had already spoken. The recess felt longer than an hour. The gallery didn't clear out. No one wanted to leave. Reporters stayed in their seats, huddled in pairs, scribbling notes and whispering theories. A few rushed to the pay phones in the hallway, calling their editors, trying to get the story out before anyone else. The police officers who'd been sitting near the front quietly moved toward the exits. Some left entirely. Others stood in the back, arms crossed, faces unreadable. Stephanie St. Clair stepped outside with Fraser. They didn't go far, just to a small alcove near the courtroom doors where they could speak without being overheard. She didn't ask him what would happen next. She already knew. Fraser didn't offer reassurances. He simply reviewed his notes, calm and methodical, the way a surgeon checks his instruments before the next incision. At 2:55 the bailiff opened the doors. People filed back in. The energy in the room had shifted. The certainty that had filled the space that morning was gone. In its place was something unstable. Doubt. Confusion. The kind of tension that comes when a narrative collapses and no one's sure what replaces it. Judge Whitmore returned at exactly 3 o'clock. Everyone stood. He sat. The room sat. His face was stone. Mr. Holbrook, have you reviewed the evidence submitted by the defense? Holbrook stood slowly. He looked like a man who'd spent the last hour in a storm. His tie was loosened slightly. His assistants sat behind him, one with a hand over his mouth, the other staring at the table. Yes, Your Honor. And what is the people's response? Holbrook took a breath. When he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had been all trial. Careful. Your Honor, the people acknowledge that certain financial irregularities appear to exist in the records presented by the defense. However, these irregularities do not exonerate the defendant. They are separate matters that may warrant internal review, but they do not change the fact that Mississippi St. Clair operated an illegal gambling enterprise. It was a retreat dressed up as a position. Judge Whitmore stared at him. Mr. Holbrook, the evidence presented by the defense indicates that officers involved in this investigation, officers who testified in this courtroom under oath, were receiving payments from gambling operations. The same operations you claim the defendant was running. Do you not see the problem? Your Honor, Do you not see, the judge continued, his voice hardening, that if your own witnesses were on the payroll of the very enterprise you're prosecuting, then every piece of testimony, every raid, every piece of evidence gathered by those officers is now tainted? Holbrook said nothing. The judge leaned forward. Did Detective Brennan receive payments from gambling operations in Harlem? I don't know, Your Honor. Did Captain Dorsey? Silence. Did anyone in your office verify the financial integrity of the officers assigned to this case before you put them on the stand? We trusted That's not an answer. Holbrook's hands gripped the edge of his table. He looked like a man standing in quicksand, realizing too late that every movement just pulled him deeper. Judge Whitmore opened the folder again. He pulled out one page. Held it up. This is an affidavit from Officer Samuel Kirby, signed under penalty of perjury. He states that he was instructed by his superior to conduct raids on Miss St. Clair's operation not because of evidence of illegal activity, but because she refused to make protection payments to precinct leadership. He further states that other operations, larger operations run by white mobsters, were left untouched because they did pay. He set the page down. Does the prosecution dispute the authenticity of this affidavit? Holbrook didn't answer immediately. He glanced at his assistants. One of them shook his head slightly. We would need time to investigate. You had 18 months to investigate, Mr. Holbrook. 18 months to build this case. And in all that time, you didn't think to ask whether the officers bringing you evidence were themselves involved in the very crimes you were prosecuting? The room was silent. Not the silence of anticipation. The silence of a collapse. One of the reporters in the front row stood up and walked toward the exit. Then another. They weren't leaving to file stories. They were leaving because they knew what was coming, and they needed to be the first ones to the phone. Judge Whitmore looked at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, I want to be clear about what has happened here. The defense has presented evidence suggesting that the investigation into Mississippi St. Clair was not conducted in good faith. That officers involved in gathering evidence were themselves receiving money from gambling operations. That raids were selectively conducted. That testimony may have been coerced or fabricated. He paused. Under these circumstances, I cannot in good conscience allow this trial to continue. The integrity of the prosecution has been compromised. The credibility of the witnesses has been destroyed. And the defendant's right to a fair trial has been violated. Holbrook's face went white. Your Honor, if we could request a continuance. No, Mr. Holbrook. The judge's voice was final. The people have had their opportunity. You brought this case. You called your witnesses. You presented your evidence. And now the foundation of that case has crumbled. I will not allow this defendant to sit through another trial built on the same poisoned investigation. He looked down at his notes. Then back at Holbrook. Does the prosecution wish to present any further evidence that does not rely on the testimony or investigative work of the officers named in the defense's submission? Holbrook stood there frozen. He had nothing. The entire case had been built on raids, on testimony, on evidence gathered by the very officers whose integrity was now in question. Without them there was no case. He looked at his assistants. They looked back helpless. Finally, quietly, Holbrook spoke. No, Your Honor. The judge nodded. Then the people have no case. He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you are dismissed. There will be no verdict. This case is over. He looked at Stephanie St. Clair for the first time since the trial began. Mississippi St. Clair, you are free to go. He stood. The gavel came down once. The courtroom exploded. Reporters rushed for the doors. Police officers stood and left without a word. The jury sat there, stunned, unsure if they were supposed to leave or stay. Holbrook remained at his table, staring at nothing, his career crumbling in real time. Stephanie St. Clair stood slowly. She adjusted her gloves, picked up her purse, turned to Fraser and nodded once. Then she walked out the same way she walked in. Calm, unhurried, unshaken. As if she'd always known how it would end. The hallway outside the courtroom was chaos. Reporters swarmed the doors, shouting questions at anyone who came through. Flashbulbs popped. Voices overlapped. The marble floors echoed with the sound of 40 people trying to get the same story at the same time. Mississippi St. Clair. Mississippi St. Clair, do you have a statement? Will you press charges against the officers? Did you know about the corruption before the trial? What happens to your operation now? Stephanie St. Clair walked through the center of it without stopping. Fraser walked beside her, one hand raised slightly to keep the reporters at a distance. He didn't push anyone. He didn't need to. His presence alone created space. A few officers still in uniform stood near the stairs, watching her pass. Their faces were blank, unreadable. But they didn't move toward her. They just watched. She descended the courthouse steps into the cold February afternoon. The sky was gray, the kind of gray that threatened snow but hadn't decided yet. A few people waited on the sidewalk. Women from Harlem who'd taken the train down, men in wool coats who'd come to see what would happen. When they saw her, a few of them nodded. One woman smiled, just slightly, and turned away. Stephanie St. Clair stopped at the bottom of the steps. Frazier looked at her. You don't have to say anything. She looked back at the courthouse. At the columns. At the doors where, 3 days ago, the district attorney had walked in thinking he'd already won. Then she turned to the reporters. I have nothing to say about the trial, she said clearly. The judge made his ruling. The case is over. But the corruption, one reporter started. The corruption, she said, was not my invention. It was simply revealed. What the city chooses to do with that information is the city's business. Not mine. Will you continue running your operation? She looked at the man who asked. He was young, eager, holding his notebook like it was a weapon. I will continue, she said, to live in Harlem, to work, to contribute to my community, as I have always done. Do you feel vindicated? She paused. I feel, she said slowly, exactly as I did when I walked into that courtroom. The law does not change who I am. A verdict does not make me innocent or guilty. Only my actions do that. And I know what my actions have been. She didn't wait for the next question. She turned and walked toward the street where a car was waiting. Frazier opened the door. She got in. The car pulled away from the curb and disappeared into traffic. The reporters stood there for a moment, scribbling, then scattered toward the nearest phones. Inside the courthouse, Martin Holbrook sat alone at the prosecution table. The courtroom had emptied. The jury was gone. The judge was gone. His assistants had left to make calls, which meant they were already trying to distance themselves from the disaster. He sat there with the folder still on the table in front of him, the 14 pages that had destroyed everything. He didn't open it again. He didn't need to. He'd read it during the recess. Every page. Every name. Every date. And the worst part wasn't that the defense had found it. The worst part was that it had been there the entire time. In bank records. In memos. In affidavits waiting to be filed. He could have found it himself if he'd looked. But he hadn't looked. He'd assumed. He'd trusted. He'd believed that because the officers wore badges, they were clean. That because the system said it was working, it was. And now his career was over. Not officially. Not yet. But he knew how these things worked. The mayor's office would distance itself. The DA would reassign him to minor cases, traffic violations, things that didn't matter. He'd spend the rest of his tenure pushing paper until he resigned quietly and disappeared into private practice somewhere upstate. He'd wanted a case that would make his name. He got one. Just not the way he'd imagined. By evening, the story was everywhere. Judge dismisses St. Clair case, cites police corruption. New York Times. Harlem numbers Queen walks free after explosive revelations. Daily News. NYPD under fire after trial collapse. Herald Tribune. The Amsterdam News ran it on the front page with a photograph of Stephanie St. Clair leaving the courthouse, her face calm, her posture perfect. The headline read, Queenie wins, system loses. The article didn't celebrate. It simply reported. But between the lines the message was clear. She hadn't just beaten the charges. She'd exposed the rot underneath them. And in Harlem, where people had watched the police raid their buildings, arrest their neighbors, and take money from the same criminals they were supposed to be stopping, that mattered more than any verdict ever could. Stephanie St. Clair didn't go home that night and throw a party. She went home, made tea, and sat by the window. The city kept moving. And so did she. The 14 pages told a story the newspapers couldn't fully print. Not because the facts weren't there, but because the facts implicated too many people, touched too many precincts, reached too far up the chain of command. The reporters wrote what they could: corruption, payoffs, selective enforcement. But the deeper architecture of what those pages revealed stayed buried under the language of allegations and ongoing investigations. Stephanie St. Clair knew what was on those pages because she'd spent 2 years making sure they existed. Not all at once. Not with some grand plan. Just carefully. Methodically. The way someone builds a wall one brick at a time, knowing that someday they might need to stand behind it. Every time a police officer took an envelope, someone saw it. A shopkeeper. A building super. A woman sweeping her stoop. Harlem had eyes everywhere, and those eyes reported back. Not to the police. To her. Every time a raid happened, she noted the date, the time, the officers involved. She tracked which operations got hit and which ones didn't. She watched as white mobsters ran bigger games, louder games, and never saw a single badge at their door. She documented the disparity. Not for justice. For leverage. She hired a lawyer who understood that defense wasn't just about courtroom arguments. It was about preparation. About knowing what the other side had before they used it. Frazier had spent a year quietly filing subpoenas, requesting records, interviewing people who'd been threatened into silence. He found Officer Kirby 6 months before the trial started, a man with a conscience and a pension he was afraid to lose. Frazier promised him protection. Anonymity if possible. Exposure only if necessary. Kirby signed the affidavit. The bank records came from 3 different institutions. Stephanie St. Clair had people who worked there, tellers, clerks, assistants who processed transactions every day and noticed when the same officers made deposits that didn't match their salaries. They didn't steal records. They copied them. Carefully. Legally, through subpoena once Frazier had enough cause to request them. The internal NYPD memo was the hardest piece to get. It came from someone inside the department. Someone who'd watched good officers get buried under bad orders. Someone who believed the system could be better but knew it wouldn't change unless someone forced it to. They slipped the memo to Frazier through an intermediary, a priest at a Harlem church who'd known Stephanie St. Clair for years and trusted her more than he trusted the precinct captains who showed up on Sundays pretending to be righteous. The photograph of the envelope exchange was taken by a private investigator Frazier hired. Former NYPD himself, forced out years earlier for refusing to take a bribe. He knew the corners. He knew the timing. He knew which officers were dirty and where they conducted business. He sat in a parked car with a camera for 11 nights before he got the shot. When he did, he had it notarized the same day. Time-stamped. Legally documented. Unimpeachable. That was what 14 pages represented. Not luck. Not coincidence. Strategy. Stephanie St. Clair had known for years that if the city ever came after her seriously, it wouldn't be because she broke the law. It would be because she refused to play by their rules. Refused to pay the right people. Refused to accept that the game was rigged in one direction only. So she built an insurance policy. And when Holbrook finally came with his 18 months of preparation, his mountain of evidence, his certainty that he'd finally caught her, she handed him 14 pages and watched his case disintegrate. Not because she was innocent. Because she was prepared. And in Harlem, preparation was survival. Years later, people still told the story. Not in courtrooms. Not in newspapers. But in barbershops and backrooms, on stoops and street corners, in the kind of conversations that happen when someone asks what Harlem used to be like before everything changed. They didn't talk about the numbers game. That faded. The mob moved in eventually, the way floods move into low ground, inevitable, unstoppable. Dutch Schultz pushed harder. Other operators folded or fled. Stephanie St. Clair fought back as long as she could, but the tide was too strong. By the end of the 30s, her empire was gone. But the trial stayed. The story of the 14 pages. The DA who thought he had her. The courtroom that went silent. The system that collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. People remembered that. Because it wasn't just about Stephanie St. Clair beating a case. It was about what she revealed. That the law wasn't neutral. That the badges could be bought. That the same officers raiding Harlem took envelopes from the criminals they were supposed to stop. That justice was selective, and the selection was based on who paid and who didn't. She didn't change the system. No one person could. But she exposed it. Publicly. Undeniably. And in a neighborhood that had spent decades being told to accept how things were, that exposure mattered. Stephanie St. Clair lived another 30 years. She stayed in Harlem. Wrote letters to newspapers. Fought other battles. Some she won. Some she didn't. But she never disappeared. Never went quiet. Never pretended the world was fair just because people wanted her to. When people ask what she's remembered for, the answer isn't simple. Not the numbers. Not the wealth. Not even the fight with the mob. It's the 14 pages. And the lawyer who stood up and read them while the whole system listened.